What's different about the second woman, though? It's not a fully scripted script, and there was one person, this man leaned in, and she pulled away, and he pulled her head, and that is what the entire audience did. Like, I found that so shocking, and I was like, did he know he was going to do that?
Is it the excuse that we were just acting,
or was that his natural reaction to her pulling away was to pull her in?
Yeah, and makes you question so much about this person who isn't Marty the character. Like, who the hell do you think you are? Is this how you engage in the outside world? Yeah. You're either a really good actor because you've made everyone in this room hate you, or you have some serious work to do to address the kind of reaction and behaviour that you have to this.
I don't know what the answer. I don't know what version.
And that's terrifying, isn't it?
And this was her space.
Yeah. It was her cube, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was her space.
I think women typically give up so much space to appease people. And this is like a big unlearning that a lot of women have to do as well, is actually, if I have to consider you in how I move and where I am and what I do, but I'm not afforded the same consideration, what does that say for the learning and perspective? Or like what we're teaching young women about perspective of the world versus what we're teaching young men.
Your point that you're just making also makes me think of it's not binary in terms of men and women. It's much more nuanced about who takes up the space, how much space is someone afforded when we factor in intersectionality, and whether one or both of those people are black or South Asian or from another cultural background.
And I think the cultural aspect has a massive part in how men and women treat each other.
Yeah, and also whether one or both of those people are trans, whether there's someone who has an obvious physical disability or perhaps a learning disability or difficulty, because of the judgments that people make very rapidly about who takes up the space, what space is allowed to be given, who holds the power in that dynamic.
And in the space.
And the consideration, And I think that's where it goes back to, what I think in terms of the play, and also the women at large in all our different guises, about our capabilities and our expectations that we have of ourselves and that others put on us. And when he did that to her, I mean, there was audible gasps from the entire audience, and she was also shocked. You could see that kind of freezing that so often is part of a response to something that is shocking. She didn't flee, she didn't fight, she froze.
What are the 4 fear responses, sorry?
So there's definitely freeze, flight,
fight. Fawn is one of them though, isn't it?
Yes, you are right.
Do you think that that is what a lot of, do you think freeze and fawn as fear responses are a lot of what women are expected to do when they're afraid? Definitely. Appease and be still.
Yeah.
Because that's
passive.
It's, just be passive. If you're uncomfortable, just be passive and it will be over.
But also, I think in those moments, it's survival. It's not even when people generally are and animals as well, because animals do these things when they're in a fearful situation like that where they feel threatened, it's an instinctive response. There is no thought.
Yeah.
It just happened. She was stunned, like we were all stunned. And I wish I could remember what happened next. And because the dance scene is what follows after that. And I can't remember the dance scene. I think we're all just so like...
Do you think that those dance scenes were the way that she really felt about...
That was her asserting her power, for sure. So the opposite player, Marty, was always trying to maneuver Virginia into different parts of the room, as would be expected in a very traditional dance partnership where the male lead takes the lead. But the way she asserted her physicality in that space, she held a lot of power. And you can see that in terms of some of the outrageous things she did, but also some of the really, what I was mentioning before about the dead weight, when she turned herself into a weight.
I mean, don't underestimate that as like a means of defense. Like, actually, if someone ever grabs you, just go to that. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know that she was always using it as defense. It was a dramatic move, I suppose, to get a rise from the audience in some way, shape, or form, to provoke the man into doing something different. There was a lot of provocation in, I suppose. So that dancing is a very good example, I think, each time about who has the power, who's trying to assert the power, and that power shifting, moments by moments.
Well, I mean, that's...
even within the same scene.
Yeah. But that's also so the dynamic of the world, like even just walking down the street, the power shifts, like whether it's something that you earn or it's something that is just taken. It's existent. Assumed is always... Assumed is the one kind of power dynamic that I hate the most. And I'll tell you pourquoi. It feels like a game. And it's so difficult because I don't want to play that game. And so you have to kind of... I have to do an awful lot of unlearning in the behaviors that I have when people assume that they are higher than me. Because it's never that people assume that they're lower than you. It's always that they assume that they are higher than you. And the want to not make anything uncomfortable, but the necessity that you have to push back in order to not play into a power dynamic that you don't want to be a part of. And I think that has mainly been a frequent one, more so with my female friends.
Interesting. There's also there's an age gap between us.
What?
Yeah. About 20 years, I think. Thereabouts. And I think, unfortunately, for people who are, in their teens and their 20s, that is a much more common thing. I certainly remember that at the age to you are now. But it also makes me think of how we respond to older women who don't tolerate that anymore.
No, but I also think generationally as well, the power dynamics that women had to, and this is predominantly white women, working their way into a career where actually the diversity that was existent was there is one chair for a woman. So I've been thinking about this book, this entire conversation, Why We Should All Be Feminists, and it's featured in a Beyonce song about, like, we teach girls to shrink themselves and make themselves smaller, and the only competition that women are taught to have is against other women. we don't teach them to compete with each other or against men in a healthy way. We teach them that the only way to win power is to compete with other women, because there's only one spot at the table. I have worked in very, very random jobs in my life, which I've loved. The bosses that I have had have been so varied, multiple backgrounds, heaps of different ages. I've worked with people who have been horrible, colleagues who have been horrible, older men who have been just horrible. I understand that you can't like everyone in the world. The patience that I really had to hold on to in those moments. I have worked for an older woman, and the experience that I had with her was so deeply fascinating. Now, she worked in like pretty glamorous industry in the 80s and 90s when there was very literally only one spot for a woman. It was also in the music industry. So the way that she engaged with other women was in a very competitive, very like, I don't like you because there's a threat here. And it was an interesting dynamic to have. Some of the most abrasive bosses that I have been women who have had to compete and fight for their careers so hardcore that any other woman, even now, is a threat to them. And that is such an interesting power dynamic.
I agree. And so I, as you know, I work part of my working week in the NHS, which is, you know, and my part of the NHS that I'm in is largely female workforce. But the times in my careers where I've been sort of surprised, shocked about how the way women treat each other, because largely we don't have that. I would say in my world we don't have that kind of competition. But there have been times when, for example, I've been line managing women who are pregnant, and I don't have children, but my boss, or bosses, because it's happened multiple times, are mothers, and so I treat all of my direct reports with the, you know, this is what you, in a personalised way, I suppose. This is what you need. This is what you're asking for. Can we make those allowances to get the best out of you through your pregnancy? Yes. Do what needs to be done to help people work at their best. And my bosses not liking me doing that, making those decisions, because that wasn't what happened to them.
And it's
So
not fostering the environment to...
We're not breaking the cycle. Once someone's oppressed at one level of generation, and the expectation is that that level of oppression has to continue because that's what I experienced. And we see that. But
the perspective is so skewed, because it's like, oh God, you know what? Oh yeah, I remember my pregnancy. That would be awful. God, I wish I had had that. But absolutely, and you must need that.
And I think white women, it has to be said, white women are very guilty of that. I couldn't speak for whether women from other backgrounds also experience that kind of intergenerational behaviour or not, but I've definitely witnessed that amongst generations of white women. Which makes me feel sad, really.
If the goal is to break a pretty vicious cycle of mistreatment, essentially, because that is what it is. And so there is that perspective that, just because you know, I chose to have kids and I didn't get that special treatment, and you're choosing to have kids and you don't actually like...
We're getting the best out of people.
How do we all in our friendship groups have those conversations about perspectives, patience, and bad behavior, and holding ourselves accountable and holding our friends accountable, actually, for bad behavior?
I really wish I could remember how Ruth responded to that particular...
in her liturgical movement.
And what happened next. But there were definite other times where she was clearly losing her patience. And that wasn't, I mean, it wasn't necessarily to do with fatigue. It was more obvious
Yeah.
When I went back the second time, and that was, so she'd have been going for what would we say? Well, more than 16 hours by that point. Well, 16 hours by that point.
Just whenever we talk about that, it does, like, I feel a wave of just like, God, I could really go for a nap right now. Yeah. Kind of like, how have you done that?
Yeah.
I think there's a importance for us to end these things with like a generalized call to action question. Maybe like a story that we want people to share, like obviously both men and women, because obviously we want, even though we're two women talking about this, we want to be able to kind of,
two white women.
My general question, obviously to you, because you're a coach, is approaching, how much perspective is actually harmful for someone?
It's a really big question. I don't think we can have enough perspective, really. There isn't too much perspective, but what there can be is paralysis with too much perspective.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the perspective per se that's the problem in those sorts of scenarios. It's the, how do I make a decision? How do I use this information?
So when it comes to perspective, it's having enough.
But the more perspective we can have, the more compassion we can have. Yeah. Which I'm a big believer in. I don't always get things right with people. I upset people. I get upset myself. It's the compassion that if we can find the bit to be compassionate about, even if we struggle with holding a lot of compassion for another person, even if there's one thing that we can hang on to that we respect or have compassion for. So even for that man who behaved either abominably through acting or abominably through instinct, where's the compassion,
consideration, perspective
for him, actually? Yeah.
How do you have patience for others whilst they unlearn?
It's not like we arrive to a destination.
Yeah.
That is something that if we've got self-inquiry and reflection going on, then life is an unlearning process.
That's the perfect end.
We weren't going for half an hour, were we? I don't know. It certainly wasn't enough time for me to completely finish my tea.